Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. This is the second of 3 webinars in a series on getting to gene-based diagnosis, finding your way through the genetic testing to a diagnosis. This one is called Diagnosis or No Diagnosis. What's next? The next one is on August 31st, sorry. The previous one is already available as a downloadable recording or a replay webinar. And next slide, please. As I mentioned, that next webinar in this series, the third of 3, that's October 31st. And that is making decisions about a genetic counselor. No, sorry. Making decisions about genetic testing, gene therapy, and clinical trials, weighing your options. And the one we did a couple weeks ago is available for replay, and that's how to effectively partner with your genetic counselor to accelerate your rare diagnosis. And just as that one is available on demand, each one about a day after the fact would be available as a link. So if you have friends that should have been here to hear this one tonight but couldn't, you can tell them to find the link. We'll provide the links afterwards. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm going to introduce our panelists, and after that, we'll start a pretty loose discussion based on the topics that relate. A lot of this content is based on our toolkit that we've just developed in the same topic. And then we will use almost the second half of our session together as question and answer. And that's largely due to so many of you sending in questions. And you can continue to do that. You can use the chat box, or sorry, the Q&A box on your Zoom nav bar at the bottom. And all throughout tonight, you can add your questions and we will get to them in the second half. And then we'll conclude with some of the great resources that have been developed by Global Genes for this program. It's really getting to be a rich collection on this topic. So next slide, please. What we're going to cover tonight, hopefully you'll learn how to get advice on managing your care, navigating finances, and coping with the emotional impact, whether or not you get a diagnosis through genetic testing, and what you can do if you remain undiagnosed, how to continue searching or dealing with their situation lacking a diagnosis. Next slide, please. I mentioned there are toolkits related to each of these webinars, and this one has a toolkit that's same name as the webinar, Diagnosis or No Diagnosis, What's Next? And then there is a toolkit for genetic testing, getting to a diagnosis, but there are also sort of smaller content pieces that we've pulled out of those toolkits. The one you see featured at the bottom is a great one-page resource from Dr. Nicole Glenn, who's a pediatrician and a rare disease mom. And those are tips for dealing with a complex care team and who coordinates that team. And then there's something a little bit more involved, which is comparing all the different types of genetic testing, the pros and cons of each one. And that's pretty handy in a chart form. So we'll have links to all of those that can be downloaded from the Global Genes Resource Hub, and we share them on our new Rare portal as well. Next slide, please. So our panelists tonight, I'm thrilled to have met both of these wonderful people through a film festival that I put on. Dr. Lorenzo Botto is a pediatrician and a medical geneticist. He's leading a multidisciplinary team at the University of Utah Health to help diagnose and treat families with undiagnosed and rare conditions. And Jessie Fein is a mother to 3 children that she and her husband adopted from Guatemala. One of them, her daughter Dahlia, has the rare mitochondrial disease MERF syndrome. And Jessie writes about raising her daughter with a rare disease and is on the board of directors for Mito Action. In her spare time, she heads brand and creative at Bright Horizons. So, well, I got to tell people who I am, I guess. I'm Daniel DeFabio. In addition to my role at Global Genes, where I'm Associate Director for Community Engagement, I was father to a boy with the rare, ultra rare syndrome, Menkes disease. So I've been through some of this experience firsthand. So thank you both for joining us tonight. And next slide, please. Jesse, I think we'll just ask you to tell a little bit of your story and how Dahlia came into your lives and how, unfortunately, rare disease came into your lives.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. And I love looking at this slide because I think she's just about the cutest child on the face of the earth. So what you see here is Dahlia as a baby, Dahlia on her first day of kindergarten, and Dahlia So as Daniel said, all three of our children are adopted from Guatemala. We met Dahlia in Guatemala when she was 3 months old. Got to spend a couple of days with her. We met her birth mother and her birth grandmother, signed the paperwork, and at 6 months, we were invited to come back and adopt her, bring her back home with us. And she was absolutely delightful and gurgling and rolling over and doing the things one might expect a 6-month-old to do. But as time went on, I had a feeling something wasn't quite right. I had another son we had brought back from Guatemala a couple of years earlier, so I had some idea of how he had developed. And I was doing that thing where I was trying to decide, do I compare my kids to each other? Like, I've got this other person living in my house and it feels very objective to say he was doing such and such at such and such age, and she's not doing that. Is there something wrong? And then I had a piece of me saying, everybody develops at their own pace, let it be. But as time went on, I really did feel that something wasn't right. She had a very wobbly gait and she had some speech delays. So I had early intervention come to the house and they assured me everything was fine, that I was overreacting, that she was just perhaps a little bit on the lower end of average. We didn't know much about her prenatal. Give it some time, she'll surely catch up. A few months later, I invited early intervention back to the house and they said, she's fine. Give it some time and she'll catch up. In the meantime, of course, I was involving our primary care physician and he was saying essentially the same thing. The third time I invited them to the house, they did not want to come, but I begged and I pleaded and early intervention came out and sure enough, they said, she's fine, there's nothing wrong with her. That was at age 3. But as she got older, the delays became more pronounced. And finally, I had a conversation with the primary care physician where he said to me, what is it you're afraid is wrong? And I said, I'm afraid there's something wrong with her brain. And when I said it, I realized that I was afraid there was something wrong with her brain. I hadn't really put that together yet. So he sent us, he started off by sending us for a hearing test because her issues were speech and balance related. And sure enough, she was diagnosed with an unexplained mild to moderate hearing loss. And we also were sent to see a neurologist who asked us all kinds of questions, including, does she have seizures? To which I said, no, she's never had a seizure. And he said, well, what's she doing there? Her hands trembled. And I said, oh, that's just the way she is. I'd never, I didn't realize that was a seizure. And so these clues, and because she was adopted, led us to a geneticist who did a genetic workup. And we were diagnosed immediately with MERF syndrome, 2 in a million mitochondrial disease that's degenerative. That was at age 5. But she really was a pretty healthy, other than the fact that she had this ultra rare degenerative disease, she was pretty healthy. I mean, she was mainstreamed, she was in school, she was still walking at the time. And what they couldn't tell us very much about what to expect in terms of the progression, because it was such a rare disease, they simply didn't have the data. They couldn't tell us, for example, the rate of degeneration we should expect. But the fact that she was wobbly meant she would most certainly end up in a wheelchair. When I pressed him, they said 3rd grade. She beat that by a few years. She was in a wheelchair by 1st grade. The fact that she had mild hearing loss meant she'd end up being totally deaf. So they could tell us that those areas where she was having issues would certainly get worse, but they did not know where else in her body the disease might strike or what it might mean in the long term. Fast forward, when she turned 9, we went on a vacation to Florida. She caught a cold that quickly became pneumonia. We ended up in the hospital there. We're flown back to Mass General Hospital here in Boston, where we remained for 3 months. And by the time Dahlia left the hospital, she had a trach and a G tube. She was vent dependent. She no longer had the ability to walk, to talk, to breathe without the ventilator, to eat. And that was age 9. She was still able to communicate with us at that time through movement, through nodding, through shaking her head, through pointing. But she is now 16, and over the last several years, she's lost all ability to move. So she is totally 100% frozen. She can't even blink her eyes. And she also 2 years ago was diagnosed on top of the Murph syndrome with Lee's disease, which we are told there are 6 children who have had that dual diagnosis in the world. And so that pretty much leads us to where we are today. Our lives are full of medical equipment and nursing and fear and uncertainty, but also an enormous amount of love and hope and joy, and very much a day by day kind of existence. So if we want to go to the next slide, I think this is just the bonus slide where we get to ooh and ah over how adorable she is. This is actually a wheelchair costume, a Halloween costume that was made for her by a terrific organization called Magic Wheelchair. And it's actually through that organization that I met Daniel at his film festival. That was several years ago. And we got to kind of give Dahlia the spotlight on Halloween, which is a tremendous thing for a child who can't walk or eat, since Halloween is really focused on both of those things. And here we are. And the little interesting tidbit is that tomorrow we are going to be spending the day back at Mass General. We have enrolled in a clinical trial. We are told not to get our hopes up. We are told this will not change the trajectory of her disease, which is not good, but it might help some other kiddos in the future. And also they can tell us what they want, but you never know. And you know, we will try anything here to have been enrolled in this study, and it happens.
Yeah. Thanks, Jesse. It's a great way to get to know Dahlia through those pictures, especially. But your story is so important, and for you and Dahlia, and it happens to be true for me and my son Lucas. We once we looked for a diagnosis, we got it relatively quickly. But that's not typical. I think we as advocates know how often that journey is much, much longer. So I want to talk about that need in those longer journeys for persistence, and how we can keep trying and coming back for what's the next option, or is there another test that can be more helpful? So Dr. Botto, any thoughts about how people first come to the diagnostic process, and when they might get discouraged and they shouldn't get discouraged? And you're muted right now, Dr. Botto.
Right, yes. I think Jessica's journey with Dahlia is really exemplifies, you know, some of the, a rather typical diagnostic journey, or sometimes a diagnostic odyssey. The things that I perhaps wanted to point out is that things may seem rather non-specific at the beginning, and it's quite obvious that both early intervention and the pediatrician first look for the common things. And so I think that's part of, part of the process. Common things are common, and so a lot of things get diagnosed right there and then. But as Dahlia's journey is actually teaching us, then if you have one of the rarer conditions, well, then the journey gets longer. what is important, I think, together with the persistence, is how the condition evolves over time. So the more specific the findings, I think the more likely it is that one can reach a firm diagnosis. As has been explained, the specialists that saw Dahlia really were looking for what we call diagnostic handles. This was the hearing loss, that's fairly specific, although it's common. Say seizures tend to be a good diagnostic handle because they are objective and they really signify that there's something important that's happening in the brain. And both of those can be followed up with imaging or with some other testing.
And I would add there, to this notion of objective versus subjective, nobody really wanted to listen to me when I was like, well, I have a feeling something's not right and she's kind of wobbly. But when we had, objectively, she's having seizures, or objectively, she's got this hearing loss, it became a different storyline. I would also say, though, that even when you get that diagnosis, and Daniel, I wonder if this is, was your case, knowing that she had a mitochondrial disease, like I did not know what mitochondria were, truly. I knew nothing. I was writing down words that I could Google later, which is a whole other webinar on the, pluses and minuses of Googling. But even when you do get a diagnosis, it's like you've entered such foreign territory if you're not, in the medical or scientific, or, if you're just not knowledgeable about these kinds of, which I for sure wasn't.
Yeah, it definitely feels like diagnosis is the very beginning of your learning. You're thrust into, unless you were already a doctor or a geneticist or something, you're thrust into educating yourself in a way you probably never intended to be. And yeah, Google can help, but it probably only gets you so far.
Yeah. I
think almost everyone probably on this call would have the experience too of leaning on the community. That's if there exists a community for your rare disease, that's certainly a better step than leaning on the pluses and minuses of Google searches.
Yes, and I think it's also important to realize that rare and ultra rare conditions are the ones about which we know the least, but also the ones about which the learning curve for everyone, clinicians and families alike, that learning curve tends to be the let's say steepest. There's new information that continuously is being developed for these newer conditions. And so, nobody has to be, put at fault because they don't know every single one of the, 7,000 genetic conditions. So, in this sense, I think one important point, and I think, so Jessica, you can also speak to that. It's really important that family and the clinical team eventually become partners, because each group, each person leans on the other to learn more and together as a group to provide the best information and the best plan of care.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that. And I know that at the beginning when, shortly after diagnosis, when we started to have so many different specialists, and I remember saying to the primary care physician, like, who's the quarterback, who's coordinating all of this? And he said, well, I'll be the quarterback. But pretty quickly it was clear he wasn't the quarterback, I was the quarterback, because it was not long before I knew more about this disease than he did. And he's a wonderful doctor and he did everything to learn about it. But I, first of all, knew more about the specific ins and outs of this disease because I was spending all my time trying to learn about it, and he had other patients after all, but also because I knew my daughter, so I knew how it was manifesting in her. And so that it is important to realize that at the end of the day, you or a family member is probably going to be that quarterback. And there are going to be times, perhaps, when members of the team disagree. I even had one recently when there was a question of whether or not Dahlia should go to the hospital, something was happening. And I literally had a doctor on my cell phone and a doctor on my landline saying different things. So you end up really having to take some charge yourself, which is really unsettling because, again, unless you're a doctor, it's like I don't want to have to know more than the doctors. Like that's not my job, but it becomes your job.
Yeah, my experience was very similar, Jesse. With my son, we sort of expected his pediatrician to be able to quarterback the team, and she was willing to, but as it happened, she was not in the hospital system we were dealing with the most. And that put her at a great disadvantage. Mm-hmm. So we always had a little bit more information from all the specialists than she could get that information, but we had it more at our fingertips, and that was definitely a factor. And it, as you said, it felt unsettling and unwanted that we would have that role. I think outside of rare disease, it's not so typical that you have to so actively lead your own care team.
If I can add one thing to bring these themes, if you will, back to a very practical dimension. I mean, here I think for these conditions, they A, tend to be complex, and B, they tend to change over time. So I think to speak more, I say generally, I would say if one wants to sort of help one's child in going through this process, then doing some of the things that are listed here on the slide can be extremely important. And just to go through these again, it's really helpful for the family, for the primary care provider, and also for the specialist to have in front of them a clear list of objective findings. These can be both signs and symptoms. So, for example, in Dahlia's case, a sign could be, say, seizures, and the objective finding could be, well, a sign could be the seizure as explained or witnessed by mom, who will explain this. But it can be so much more helpful if, for example, one has a video of this to show, because a video is, as you know, it really is more helpful than 1,000 words. Mm-hmm. A video, and also objective findings. So, for example, in this case, do we have an EEG that are different kinds of seizures? Do we have an MRI with an MR spectroscopy? This is a test that can look, for example, at the level of chemicals in the brain, and especially in the case of mitochondrial conditions, that can provide some really important clues as to what is going on. So having that list written down, make copies. So perhaps if you go to a new specialist, you can leave that copy with that specialist. It would ensure that you don't forget, that the specialist won't forget, and that one is able to add to that. So one has sort of a longitudinal view of how things have been evolving over time.
Yeah, and I want to pick up on that word longitudinal, because for me, it's always been a little intimidating. It just seems to imply so much data, but actually, from whatever point you start, the beginning point, there wouldn't be very much data. And then as you go, as long as you're identifying symptoms and attributing dates across time and keeping up on that, keeping that current, you're eventually giving yourself that longitudinal history. And in one of our previous conversations, Dr. Botto, you broke out what I think is a really simple, clear way to do something like that. And I hope at some point maybe Global Genes makes this as a downloadable printable for everyone. But in the meantime, it's very easy to create yourself in, say, Excel. And if you imagine the rows going, Dr. Botto told us, head to toe, literally top of the head to bottom of the feet, and think through every symptom that might occur down the path, right? Scalp issues, eyeball issues, vision, whatever it is, cortical impairments, ear, hearing issues, nose and throat issues, down the body you go. So you don't forget any system, any organ system. And so that's your rows. And then if you just treat weekly or biweekly across, that's your columns. And it's, I think, such a great organizational system. And if I didn't do it justice, Dr. Botto, you could please explain it better.
Oh, yeah, you did just fine. I mean, the one thing that I would like to add is that it's important to note what we call both the it's a pertinent positives and the pertinent negatives. So the pertinent positives are the things that don't seem quite right. So, the seizures, for the brain and so on. The pertinent negatives are the sort of the normal things, which can be important to actually write down. So, for example, if a child had a vision test and the test was normal, write it down. If the hearing test was done and it was normal, write it down. Because every piece of information, this is a jigsaw, every piece is important, whether it shows that something is not working, but also if it shows that something is actually working fine.
I think that's such good advice. And I love the idea of the video. I think that's so helpful. One thing I would say is, when you get the diagnosis, probably have a lot of people in your community, friends, family, whatever, who say, what can I do? What can I do? And, one thing you might think about is having a friend who's super organized to help set up some of these systems, because not everybody is, inclined to think about things in this very organized way and to set up the binders. And, all of a sudden you're going to have a lot of paperwork and a lot of, different files on your computer. And so that's something that, again, if feeling overwhelming, is a good thing to be say to that best friend or sister or whomever. Yeah, there is something you can help me put this structure together. Of course, it's better if you can just download it from Global Genes, but
Yes, here, next slide, please. In the next slide, we see some of the tips and recommendations we have along these lines, and there's a great section that's sort of a breakout box in the toolkit, and that was provided by, many of you will know, Parvati Krishnan as part of the Global Genes team, and she's a rare disease mom herself. So she knew just the right things to be bringing to medical appointments. And then in conversation with Jesse and in my own experience, and Dr. Botto pointing out things that have benefited from his side of the equation. If you have your records well organized, a binder or a small file cabinet, or that's a great thing to have with you. And Jesse made the point, bringing another person, because sometimes you are in an emotional fog and you are not, even though you always want to be the best advocate for yourself or for your child, you're not always in the state you need to be for that. And it can be just great to check back with a friend or family member who came with you and said, do you remember that conversation the way I remember that conversation? And
I have to say there, Daniel, because I've been the other person for many of my family members, and I would even ask what I have done as the other person is literally to just write down everything that's being said, because that way you really have the record to look back on. So if you're inviting somebody out to be a note taker.
Yes, and another one I love is to, and I can't believe how long it took me to learn this the hard way, I suppose, but leave behind documents. How many times are we all asked, what are the meds you're on? And it can be a long list. And then you're filling it out again and again and again, every appointment. It's much easier to have that ready to go. And here's my copy. And similarly, baselines, you know, what's the typical heart rate? What's the typical oxygen level? Anything that's going to come up over and over again. And unfortunately, most of us need experience as the teacher to tell us what's going to come up over and over again. But after a few years, you can get this stuff down. So I encourage people to definitely check out the toolkit for this, among many reasons. And here, a next slide, please. So maybe we can talk a little bit more about that coordinating the team and just some examples of who's on the team. And unfortunately, Jesse and I found our answer to be, we had to be the leader, but there are scenarios where you can get a little better help than I guess we were able to find. So Jesse, I don't know, any place you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, it took us a while to find out that there was a care coordinator at the hospital. And once this person entered our lives, it made such a difference, because what she was able to do that we were not is to have our appointments at the hospital be not only on the same day, but back to back. And there was no way, you know, with such wildly different departments within the hospital, that as an individual, we, you know, my husband or I could do that. So that was huge. And then the other one that you'd see there is palliative care, which was suggested to us very early on. And to be honest, I was kind of horrified when it was, I mean, I really didn't know anything. And to me, palliative care was for people who were dying. And I did not see my daughter that way. But it turns out that's not what palliative care does. They're focused on making the day-to-day more manageable in so many ways. And it is not a, you have 6 months left kind of thing. But to me, it was so scary to think about palliative care going anywhere near my daughter that I really did avoid it for many years. And boy, there were a lot of resources they provide that we could have used had I opened up to it a little bit earlier.
I completely agree with that. That was my perception too, and my misperception. And I had the same reluctance. And then when we did embrace palliative care, I was surprised how empowering it was. And not to say that your medical encounters always have to be adversarial, but when they are somewhat adversarial, palliative care in your corner, for me, made such a difference. Like, you know, the system, the medical system, they want to go through their normal pathways. And you're an abnormal case almost by definition. And there's palliative care to reinforce that and say, we're doing it differently because.
Yeah. And by the way, palliative care also came along and offered resources to my daughter's siblings, to our other children. And they're an important part of this whole equation, right? And you don't have much energy sometimes left over, but palliative care does. And they have all kinds of things, whether it's therapy or, you know, counseling or music therapy or art therapy or, you know, whole range of things that they can provide, really a service for the entire family unit.
So Dr. Botto, with your position being uniquely both a pediatrician and a geneticist and focused on rare diseases, you're probably ideally suited to lead the team, the care team. But even given that, I wonder if you could just speak to some of the complexities of having oftentimes so many specialists involved, and they need to each do their thing, and each thing has to be done in concert to a certain extent.
Yes, I think this is a critically important point. I mean, newly by definition, the majority of rare and ultra-rare conditions are complex conditions, meaning they involve multiple organ systems, you know, for the most part, and they need you know, aspects of care which are not necessarily purely, you know, medical care. And so here we have, you have made some excellent points, highlighted important resources. I would like to add one. In addition to palliative care and sort of the care coordinator that many hospitals have, there is this service which is, I think, expanding across the country, and it's called the Comprehensive Care Team. We have it here at the university University of Utah, that are in other academic and large medical centers. What this is, it is slightly different than palliative care. We do have also palliative care, but basically comprehensive care is a team of, in this case, it's a pediatrician who focus on kids with complex medical needs. And it includes, importantly, these pediatricians, nurse practitioners, let's say care coordinators, and they help take care with the family. I mean, they are sort of the quarterbacks here, because being a pediatrician, that they have this sort of, say, broader say view and interest and focus compared to the neurologists and gastroenterologists and so on and so forth. And they help also well beyond sort of the specialized care. So, for example, a child who has one of these very rare neurologic I'd say conditions, and they happen to grow out of their wheelchair and they need help with that. The nurse practitioner, the care coordinator can help with that. They've got these things like excessive drooling, which you would not go to the geneticist for that, but they can help with that. They can help with health insurance coverage. They can do the things that you have mentioned, Jesse, such a life change as seeing 5 specialists on the same day instead of going 5 times, to the hospital. So if you have a child with a complex conditions, I would encourage those of you listening here to see if the center that cares for your child has care coordinators, palliative care, but also what here we call the comprehensive care program. I think they can be, they have been a life changer for many of the families that they follow.
I wish I had a program like that available to me. And I'm glad to hear they're becoming more commonplace and more distributed around different hospital systems. So on those lines of coordinating a complicated team, we have as a simple infographic downloadable image. We'll put the link after this meeting. These tips from Dr. Nicole Glenn, who is both a pediatrician and a rare mom. So she has a great perspective to bring to this too, in terms of what she thinks can put you in your best position in working with the various specialists that you're going to need for you or your child's disease. And that's in the toolkit also. Next slide, please. So Dr. Botto, I know you had some thoughts about sort of the length of the Diagnostic Odyssey, and you had a nice metaphor for that Odyssey, and then also the role of uncertainty, at least, up until diagnosis, but sometimes even after diagnosis, there's a huge role of uncertainty. So if you could speak to that a little bit, please.
Yes, I mean, the term Diagnostic Odyssey is a term that has been, I think, generated by the families, because it's, I think it expresses well both the length sometimes, as you can see here, quite often it's years. So it represents the length. It represents also, also how it's hard it is, the ups and downs, the fact that you have to weather many storms, and that you hope to reach, somewhere. You hope at some point that this Odyssey will eventually end and make you, come up to firm ground. And firm ground is what many families seek. You had mentioned once, Daniel, that one of the good things, quote unquote, in your experience is that you got the bad news fast, because that is the length is a hard thing to go through. This long odyssey is a hard thing to go through. I tell families that this is often a marathon rather than a sprint, and so one has to be ready, number one, to take care of oneself, because it's sometimes it's a long haul, so families have to take care of themselves, because that's really key. One thing that I like to point out is that the Diagnostic Odyssey is long, and unfortunately fortunately for some families, it ends somewhere with a diagnosis that can be the basis for better management. But one also has to be realistic, and I like to sort of say that we need to have hope, but we have to beware of hype. We hear about new discoveries every week, but there is still a lot to be discovered in genetics. And so a diagnosis nowadays may not be feasible for every child with an undiagnosed condition. In our undiagnosed disease program, and this is true throughout the undiagnosed disease programs in the country and internationally, what we call the diagnostic rate, the proportion of families that get a diagnosis, is often less than 50%. So I think one has to keep that in mind. And what we're talking about here is ways to make this sort of a shorter journey through the things that we've mentioned.
Yes, and here, if you go to the next slide, I think we could, this is definitely available in the toolkit and deserves more attention than we'll give it here, but I think probably the first and last item in these columns are more self-explanatory. But Dr. Botto, if you would just talk to us a bit about when we see variants of uncertain significance, I think that's probably one of the more disappointing results. It feels like you didn't get an answer at all.
Yes, and I think let me step back for just a minute and say, nowadays I think that in the case of rare and undiagnosed conditions, it makes sense, unless the diagnosis is fairly clear from the clinical presentation, it makes sense to start the genetic test with a broad test. And nowadays, there are two main tests. One is called whole exome sequencing, and one is called whole genome sequencing. And what these tests do, they actually scan through, rather than one gene at a time, they scan through essentially all or nearly all the genes that we have. We have about 20,000 genes. And so rather than going through one and seeing it's negative, we go to the next. Now there are these tests that are going to help go through them. Now, when these tests are done, because we test 20,000 genes, every gene can have many variants. Then when you see the report come back, well, that report can be pretty complicated. And I think this slide sort of tries to get at sort of the spectrum of findings. And as you said, Daniel, there are sort of two easy reports. One is at the extreme left, one is at the extreme right. On the extreme left, we see pathogenic variants. This is a complicated way of saying we think we found what your child has. So these are variants in genes that we know based on other families and on the phenotype, on the clinical presentation, that this is very likely the answer. So that this is one thing. With this, 9 times out of 10, it means we have a diagnosis. We can start discussing the findings and going on from there. On the extreme right, benign variance means, we saw some things, but these things are normal in the average population. So really, there's nothing there. Now, the challenge, well, the benign variants can be a challenge because your child perhaps has something real, but simply this genetic testing has not found any good clue. So then the question is what can we do next, and so on. So we leave that aside for a moment. Then we have these other 3 here. The ones that I think are the most confusing to families are the ones right in the middle, these variants of uncertain significance, and they are in the middle for a good reason. As we say, it's not meat, it's not fish. We find it's a variant. So there are changes in this gene. The variants look like something that can make this gene not work. The gene themselves are important genes, but the lab is not ready to give it sufficient weight to say for sure, this is it. And so this will require I think a long conversation with your geneticist and with your team. And this can be confusing, but oftentimes in this category and also in this likely pathogenic variants, this usually means there's something more that can be done. What can be done, of course, will depend on what the findings are, but one can, depending on what had been done so far, one can do some more. It's imaging and can do some more. Let's say testing. The gene itself, if it's associated with certain clinical findings, then the clinicians can go and see if, for example, hearing and vision have been looked at carefully enough to find out whether the phenotype fits and so forth. So the variance of uncertain significant means there could be something, but this requires a good conversation and further, let's say, steps. So I think anything left from variance of uncertain significance means that we either have found something or we can find something. Anything to the right of that means there's probably nothing there at this stage of the game. It does not mean that the child does not have anything. It means that the genetic test at this point has not found clues that can direct the next steps. We need to think much further about this.
Yeah, I think so many of us, we put our faith in the science and we think this is the ultimate science. It's the genetic level of testing. And next slide, please. We know that, or we maybe are disappointed to learn that this diagnostic process isn't always black and white, and there's even uncertainty with a diagnosis, but certainly if there's a misdiagnosis or you're undiagnosed, there is all that uncertainty. And Jesse, you had a great comment. We have it there on the side. I'd like you to, just mention that, and also how you sort of extended Dr. Botto's metaphor of the Odyssey, that you want to get through the Odyssey to land. So if you just take one or both of those points.
Sure. I mean, the thing on the right, maybe it seems a little hokey, but it is definitely how we've chosen, and it didn't come right away, but how we look at things now, which is, for so much of what, anything we go through, we're like waiting for the light at the end of the tunnel. And the thing about a degenerative disease anyway is, like, we're probably not getting out of this tunnel. So there's not going to be a light at the end of the tunnel. So how can we make this tunnel as absolutely fabulous as it can be? And it took us a while to get there, but we're pretty focused on that now. And it's interesting, I think a lot of the things that we as rare parents are accustomed to are what the rest of the world has been introduced to in the last year and a half or so. This idea of living with fear and uncertainty and vulnerability, that's something we're accustomed to. The difference is, with COVID, everybody's been kind of in it together, and they're talked to about it, and the whole world is experiencing it together. As rare parents, we experience this in a very isolated way. It's something that it's hard for people to relate to. So that's my quote over there on the right. And what we were talking about was this idea of landing on an island, which is, you're at sea and everything is so topsy-turvy, and you're like nauseous and seasick, and you just don't know what's going to happen, and all you want is a diagnosis. You get the diagnosis, and you finally land on this island, but then you realize it's a deserted island. There's nobody else there, because nobody else really fully, in the rare world, it's very hard to find people who fully get it.
Yeah, great point. And if we go to the next slide, somebody who does get it, Gina, the founder of the Rare Undiagnosed Network, she has been so helpful to us in this program, and unfortunately she couldn't join us here tonight. But when you go through our toolkits, we often have rare tips and pro tips, and they're, call out boxes from the main body of the text, so they're very easy to find. But it's from, the people that have lived the experience and know it so well. So Gina told us, if I had to come up with a tagline for the undiagnosed, it would be one word: perseverance. There's a lot of feeling and emotion in that word. The journey never ends. Your life has to continue. You have to keep fighting because you only have one body. So I'm glad, at least in this way, with this slide and this quote, we've gotten Gina's input heard tonight, but her fingerprints are all over the toolkit too. So please look for them and read that. Next slide, please. So we've talked about the hope versus hype a little bit, and I think some of what Dr. Botto was getting at there is we, both on the patient side and the provider side, the medical team side, get very excited about the possibilities, and rightly so. The breakthrough for one disease could be the breakthrough for your disease, if only, or we hope. Right, but that has to be kept in some kind of balance. And Dr. Botto, you've talked, and maybe you'll repeat now, about a type of honesty from your medical team that would keep that in balance and not let there be too much reliance on the latest hype for the latest breakthroughs.
I think it would be important. Also, as you and Jesse has mentioned, I think it's really critical to have a team that you feel comfortable with, because then you can talk about these things, and being honest and straightforward is always the best policy. Sometimes when I go in a family and I tell them, well, we still don't know, then fine. I mean, these families are strong families, and I think, again, using the metaphor of finding your firm ground and moving forward, I mean, honesty is in some way firm ground. I mean, you have to be clear-eyed about things and keep on moving forward. One thing that I would add, when you choose your team and you're comfortable with them, one of the one of the things that we try to be, and many families are looking for, is someone who sticks with the family for the long term. So you don't go to a geneticist to do a test, and then if the test is negative, it's goodbye. We did what we could, and that's it. Sticking with the family means that you accept the fact that a test can be negative, that we still don't know, but there is always a future, and the future can be very practical. For example, with whole exome, whole genome sequencing, you can analyze those data after 1 year, after 15 months. And we've made diagnosis in this analysis. And this is because the field is always evolving. So there's always a future, but you have to walk through time with your team, being clear-eyed, being honest, and accepting the fact that no one is perfect, science is not perfect, and that we are partners for the long term.
Dr. Botto, I appreciate so much what you're saying about honesty and knowing that that there's a future and that things may change. I know that sometimes as a parent, though, it can feel, and I know for me it certainly has, that we're in a race against time, right? Like, are they going to be able to come up with some kind of treatment, or is it going to be a year too late? And so I think that that's something that is just worth acknowledging for the patient side, that there can very much be that feeling.
Not only on your side. I'm just off the phone with a patient who has a mitochondrial condition, and she's getting worse, and there's not much you can do for that, and it's heartbreaking. It's honestly heartbreaking, also for us.
Yeah.
We have a lot of questions that have come in, some of them in advance, and certainly if you're here now with us, you can add them in the QA chat box. But I'll get us started with one of the most surprising questions to me. It just had never occurred to me, and I'm curious to know what the options are. What can I do to follow up with studies we were involved in to see if we have a diagnosis for my daughter who died several years ago? So a posthumous patient that couldn't have been diagnosed at the time, but probably could be now. Probably Dr. Botto would have some insights on that.
Yes, now, without knowing the specifics, it's sort of a question that's hard to answer, but I could think about, I would say yes, it would be possible. One way would be, for example, if one had some stored, say, sample. It could be a blood sample, it could be some DNA that was extracted at the time. It could be a piece of tissue. Perhaps if a post-mortem was done, in this case, and some sample was taken, there are ways to extract the DNA from a lot of samples, and now we have whole genome sequencing that was not available just a few years ago. So it would be definitely a possibility. Another approach, a complementary approach, would be for the family to be reassessed by say genetics, if to go through again the family history, the clinical charts, and see how knowledge has changed. So yes, I would encourage you not to give up if this is important to you, because there would be ways. There would be ways.
And another question, what are your thoughts on genetic testing minors if there's a family history for adults in the family or with adult onset genetic disorders?
Yeah, this is this is a really important point of discussion. There are recommendations and guidelines. But to say basically, the general consensus is that you test minors. So genetic testing is very impactful testing. So it's important that you understand what you've been testing for and what the consequences are. That's why for adults, we explain and they provide, say, consent, especially for things such as whole genome sequencing and whole exome sequencing. They do impact your life in many ways. So the question is, can a parent consent for their child? And the answer is yes, if this is a condition that affects the health of the child, and this happens all the time. The question here is slightly different, though, is if it's a condition that presents in adulthood, do we have the right to test the child? And if the child, when we know that a person should have the right, to decide whether they want to know that information or not. So the general consensus, I think, is that for conditions that present in adulthood, the most sensible and respectful approach is to wait until the child has a chance to think and be able to provide, say, consent for it.
Okay. I wonder if this has been part of your experience, Jesse, but what would we suggest to people when they get a diagnosis, but they're told there's no doctor that handles this disease? We don't know of anyone for you. I have a thought that you could, and I did, I think a lot of us do, you can Google the literature and find out who's written papers on anything, either your condition or anything related to your condition. And you can start bothering those people and ask them, are you still working on this? Do you know someone who's working on this? But other than that answer, I don't know if either of you has advice on this.
Well, but one thing that was so surprising to me, because I did exactly that, right? I was Googling all the time, and I would find the people who had authored. And I remember early on, I reached out, I found, what university this particular researcher was at, and I wrote to him, and I couldn't believe it. He got right back to me. And later I realized, of course, he wanted to speak to me just as much as I wanted to speak to him, because he was studying this very rare disease. And I was saying, I've got a subject for you. And so, usually I don't know, you get intimidated about, well, I can't just reach out to this person. Well, yeah, you can. And in fact, you may find that it's very welcome. So I would say that. And then of course, the other thing is finding organizations, right? You can reach out to whether that's an umbrella organization or an organization that might be more specific to the family of diseases. Even if it's not specific to your specific diagnosis, they may be able to refer you. And then you go wherever they are in the country, right? And I'm lucky to be in Boston, because I've met so many families who came to Boston specifically for the medical care here. I was already here.
Yeah, it's hard to believe, but so many of us have found it to be true that so many of these researchers might be dealing entirely in the abstract, never having seen a living patient with the thing they're studying. And then if you come along and say, I am one, or my child is one, you're a bit of a gold mine of information for them.
And it's so funny. You're like, is this good news or bad news? I really don't know. When the head of neurology at one of the most important hospitals in the country, puts you on speed dial or gives you her home cell number and says, anytime, call me. You're like, that's great, but maybe that's not so, doesn't bode so well.
And this next question is somewhat similar. Not so much lacking a doctor, but lacking information. So the question is, what's your best advice for people that have been given a diagnosis for which there is very little information?
I don't know if you want to start, say, Jesse. I've got a few ideas, but what about from your end?
So can you say it one more time, Daniel?
Yeah, it's basically when you do get a diagnosis, but the diagnosis has very little information available about that disorder.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say it's pretty much the same as what we were saying before, which is to try to find those groups. So very early on, I was got a pamphlet for Mito Action, and I was able to really learn through Mito Action and get more information there. And then connecting. I had a woman reach out to me on Instagram from India. And it's because I've been, I post on Instagram about what we're going through, and here this woman was in India and she didn't know anybody else who had some of the things I was describing. And that's what's so great about things like social media. You can find these people even if they are so very far away. And immediately we were able to get on this chat with each other, and I was able to tell her about a clinical trial. And so just being proactive and trying to find those people who might know something, whether that's through an organization, through social media, that we're fortunate in that respect that we're in this particular time of the world.
One thing, that's one thing that I would add to expand a bit on that is, I would always try and include your say geneticists, for example, because a lot of the information needs to be filtered. It's often written in sort of the medical jargon. One has to sort of understand where that information comes from, how specific was the case series, and so on and so forth. So that's one aspect. The second is that one advantage of connecting with your favorite geneticists is that they can connect you to other specialists and networks, and they can also connect you. I mean, there is information out there that's published, so you can find it on PubMed and other places, but there's also quite a bit of information that's not published. And so, for that, you need to, connect to these networks. And so I think using those dual approaches, I think, would serve you best. But make sure that you understand where the information comes from. There's a lot of information out there. Jesse, I'm sure you've seen that. Mm-hmm. And some of it needs to be taken with a grain of salt. A condition that you think is the same of the one that your child has might actually be a different condition. So what some other family says or some other specialist says may not be directly applicable. So yeah, it can be a complex world to navigate. So be sure that there's everything in social media that yeah, you know what you're doing, and
right. Be a discerning consumer.
There you go.
And speaking of having to navigate the complexities, another question is, what is the role of a genetic counselor in navigating your diagnostic journey?
It's so important. It's so important. I think if you find a genetic counselor, he or she can be your best friend. But I think that the people who, they understand the genetics. They understand also the sort of psychosocial aspects of having a genetic condition. They can help you navigate, for example, very practically the reports of your genetic testing. That can be pretty complicated. So yeah, they are in my mind, they are absolutely crucial.
And that goes perfectly to this next question. I'm going to offer my own sort of glib answer, because the question is, how do you read a genetic report? And my off-the-cuff answer is, get help. Don't read it yourself.
Right.
Yes, and I think the genetic counselor is one great source for that. Obviously, if you're working with a geneticist, that's a great source. But if either of you have different answers to how do you read a genetic report?
I have nothing other than what you said, Daniel.
I think there's some value in having it, keeping the copy of it yourself, but I wouldn't put the pressure on yourself to really understand it. You're really just keeping it available for the next person that will understand it in case your care team changes, or the world of science changes in a few years and all of a sudden we're looking at these results differently.
Yeah, I would encourage families to, as much as possible, have the genetic testing report explained. At least the key parts. And I totally agree with keeping a copy. Keep that in your binder. I always print a copy and leave it to the family. We go through it. I highlight with my little thing the key things across those 10 pages. There are probably 3 key things there, and keep it. You are the owner of those data.
Yeah. This next question: if my child was diagnosed through a newborn screening, how do I go about getting the rest of my family genetic tested?
So if you're diagnosed through newborn screening, means that you will be referred to a geneticist. That's how newborn screening works. They do confirmatory testing, and then if the confirmatory testing is positive or it's a highly likely, you should be referred to the clinician who will go through that, and that would be the best place to ask us these questions.
And I wonder, Dr. Botto, if you have thoughts on, someone is asking, where can you seek assistance if the treatment for your disease is not available in your own country?
That's a tough question. It depends if it's, I guess it depends if it's approved as a treatment, or if it is a clinical trial. But for the first one, I mean, I'm not sure. It would be great to have sort of a specific example, but I would still go to your care provider, to your geneticist, or to the specialist, the neurologist, and ask that questions. I had someone call me just yesterday saying, well, my child has this condition. Of course I knew because I diagnosed that child. And they say, well, now there is this clinical trial that's not available in the States, is available in France. So I will be trying to connect this family for this clinical trial in France. If that's going to be feasible, it depends on the specifics of the clinical trial. But basically, I would go back to the specialist and say, I know about this treatment, and can you help me connect to where this can be put in place.
Great. This next question just came in a few minutes ago, and it's a little long, so I'm gonna give you the bottom line first, and then I'll read the whole thing. So the bottom line is, how can we advocate for more testing as a caregiver when the medical team is not as comfortable recommending that testing? But to back up to the whole context, if you had all the resources available, how best could you recommend we implement broader testing? While different kids do develop differently, it seems most pediatricians are not comfortable ordering genetic tests. Geneticists and genetic counselors are not always available in rural areas either. So how can we advocate for more testing as the caregivers, even when the medical team is not comfortable with that?
Yeah, well, there are a lot of issues to unpack here. I will start with the simple ones. In my experience, the most common situation is that we would like to do genetic testing, but the genetic testing is not covered by insurance. So this is a big policy issue. I would encourage, I just wish there were all of those tens of thousands of families with kids with rare and undiagnosed conditions would band, maybe through organizations like these, and advocate a change in the way this health system works. Because it makes complete sense from perspective of families, of the clinical teams, and of the medical team and health insurance companies as well, that we make these broad tests available sooner rather than later, rather than going, piecemeal along a lot of imaging and tests that, that are negative. For the subgroup of kids and adults that have objective findings who are getting worse over time, that have clearly identifiable conditions, let's get there sooner rather than later. That doesn't make any sense to go through all of these hoops. So that's sort of the big change that I would like to see happen. In terms of how to advocate for genetic testing, I think you can make a good case with the things we've mentioned so far. Let's not stop at what we feel, but let's go back to sort of the history, the objective findings, the clinical course. Let's make this a reasoned discussion without being adversarial. I think that will take us a long way to get to these common goals.
Jesse, we have another question, which I can tell is meant for you. I already know the answer, but you might as well tell everyone. Were you able to talk to Dahlia's birth mother about her genetics? And was that part of what informed diagnosis?
Yeah. So what happened with, it's interesting. We have 3 children, as Daniel mentioned earlier, from Guatemala. Dahlia is the only one where we met her birth mother and her birth grandmother, as a matter of fact, and we met them twice. First time we met them when we went to adopt Dahlia, and they both appeared quite healthy, and we chatted with them for a long time. When we went 2 years later to adopt our younger child, we met with them again, and we saw that birth mother had become quite ill. They did not know what was wrong with her. And of course, a few years later, we figured out what was wrong with her when Dahlia was diagnosed. And so that very night, one of the first things we did was call the adoption agency so that we could share with the birth mother and grandmother what was going on, because we realized that chances were in Guatemala, they probably didn't know what that diagnosis was. And we spent quite a bit of time trying to track her down, and the agency was unable to locate her. So do not know what ended up happening to her.
Okay. This one, the answer may be too specific to different states and different healthcare systems, but are there any financial resources for families who need genetic testing but will struggle with the expense?
Well, the answer is yes. I mean, there are various ways you can do this. So I'm sure Global Genes has a set of resources. Another couple would be through through NORD, the National Organization of Rare Diseases. In certain cases, they can help. Your local academic institution could have funds to support this. For example, we have some we have some funds for our undiagnosed families, because we seek philanthropy, and we use those those funds to do. We do a whole exome and whole genome sequencing at no cost. In some cases, there are research programs that will accept undiagnosed families with certain phenotypes, and they do these broad-based tests for free. So there is quite a bit, I think, that can be found. So, do not lose hope. Look at Global Genes, look at Nord, look at your institutions. The other place that I like to point out is the UDN, the Undiagnosed Disease Network. They have a website. It's focused on families, both kids and adults with undiagnosed conditions. And if you are accepted into those programs, then basically any testing will be for free.
Great, thank you. So here, if we go back to our slides, we're going to wrap this up. We didn't get to quite everyone's questions, but we did cover a lot. And one of the things the slides will have me mentioning is the new rare portal that Global Genes has created. And that is a perfect place to ask more questions. And all of these resources we've been mentioning tonight will be collected. There's a, if you do log into the rare portal, there's a section across the top that says browse. Under that says GBDX, getting to genetic diagnosis. And that space is all about these topics we've been covering just now and the resources related to that. And I mentioned earlier that it would be nice if Global Genes could develop a tool along the lines of Dr. Botto's longitudinal chart. And Global Genes is in fact working on something that will do health symptoms in a longitudinal study sort of way, and even incorporate, hopefully, possibly, the video elements that you had mentioned as being so useful. If you can capture your symptoms on video and preserve them and have them available, that's a great benefit to your providers. So the portal itself, for anyone who doesn't know, is an online community of people concerned with rare diseases, and at its broadest, because Global Genes is an umbrella rare disease organization, we are talking any and all things rare disease, but then that's our general discussion area. But within that, we have very specialized areas. So some people are concerned more with these genetic testing topics, and some are concerned with medical students that are interested in rare. Some are considering the issues of financial advocacy and financial impacts and financial burdens. So we have sections dedicated to each of those sort of topic areas, as well as sort of the anything goes as long as it's about rare disease. And in the true Global Genes tradition, it's really how we connect to each other and to these resources that makes the difference. So I encourage you all to log into that portal. You'll get an email following this webinar that tells you how to do that. Next slide, please. When you are on the portal, the hashtag is GBDX, and you can follow this URL. If you can't wait for the email that we're going to send you, you could go to this URL, globalgenes.org/rare-portal/. Next slide, please. As I mentioned at the top, this webinar, as all three in the series, will be available after the fact as a recording, and we'll make that available through the same link you go to register for the live webinars. That's where you go to find the recorded ones as well. Next slide, please. The resources we've been talking about, whether they're toolkits or the smaller sort of one-page pullout from a toolkit, those are all available on that same resource hub and on the Rare portal. Links will be provided there. You can download these, send them to a friend who needs them. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you to Dr. Botto and to Jesse Fein for contributing so much to all of our knowledge on these topics. And please do, if you have a friend that would have benefited from this conversation, send them the link, encourage them to watch it on the replay. If they're interested for next webinar on August 31st, they should sign up for that too, as all of you should. And we will continue our conversation then and on our portal. Thank you very much. Have a great rest of your night.